the silent negotiator. In the heart of Moscow, the winter wind howled against the windows of the Kremlin. Inside, Vladimir Putin sat in his private office, staring out over Red Square, which lay blanketed in a thick layer of snow. Despite the external calm, his mind was racing, overwhelmed by a series of challenges that had begun to feel more like an unending storm. Putin, the man who had weathered political storms and geopolitical battles with an iron will, was facing a new kind of challenge. It wasn't a military crisis or an economic collapse, but rather a diplomatic one, a test of his negotiation skills. The world was changing, shifting in ways that even he hadn't predicted, and it was no longer enough to simply outlast opponents. Now, the question was whether he could outthink them. His phone rang, breaking his thoughts. He picked it up with a steady hand. Yes. His voice was low, calm, betraying none of the tension he felt inside. It's urgent, the voice on the other end said. We need to meet. The situation has escalated, and it's no longer just about rhetoric. It's about action. We must talk, face to face. Putin's brow furrowed. The voice belonged to a leader from one of the Western nations, a man who had been a thorn in Russia's side for years. Their relations were marked by tension, mutual distrust, and years of history that had led them to this precipice. But now, the stakes had grown even higher. A looming economic crisis, territorial disputes, and military posturing had all brought them to a boiling point. He took a moment to consider the offer. A meeting like this, in secret, meant that both sides were willing to make compromises. But compromises in diplomacy often came with risks. Still, he knew he had little choice. I'll meet you, Putin replied. Where and when? The other leader suggested a secluded location, far from the eyes of the media and the international community. A neutral ground, a place where they could speak without interference. Putin agreed, and the arrangements were made. The next day, as the cold morning sun barely managed to break through the heavy clouds, Putin's motorcade sped out of the capital, heading toward the remote meeting place. The journey was long and treacherous, but it provided him with time to reflect on the path that had led him here. Russia had grown stronger in many ways under his leadership, but it had also made enemies, many of them. And now, he had to negotiate with one of them. When he arrived at the meeting site, a nondescript building hidden deep within a forested region, Putin stepped out of the car and surveyed his surroundings. There were no cameras, no reporters, no crowds, just the stillness of the Russian wilderness. It was in this solitude that the world's most powerful men often found clarity. Inside the building, the other leader was already waiting. A large wooden table separated the two men, but despite the distance, the tension was palpable. They sat across from each other in silence, each one sizing up the other, their minds racing as they prepared for the delicate dance of negotiation that lay ahead. You wanted to meet in person, the foreign leader said after a long pause. Here we are. But what do you really want, Putin? You know this can't go on forever. Putin leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving the other man. I want peace, he said simply, but not at the cost of my country's security. Russia will not bow to foreign pressures, but we will not start a war unless absolutely necessary. The other leader narrowed his eyes, his voice rising slightly. Peace? You think we're at peace now? Look around you. Tensions are rising everywhere. Economies are faltering. People are growing restless. Putin remained unmoved. It is true that the world is changing, but history has taught me one thing: negotiation is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of strength. If you want peace, you have to be willing to bend, to find common ground. The foreign leader scoffed. You, Ben, you have never shown any willingness to compromise. On the contrary, Putin responded, his voice steady. I have compromised many times, just not on things that matter. There is always room for dialogue, even with those we disagree with. But there are limits. The hours that followed were tense and filled with back and forth. The two leaders discussed everything from trade, to territorial claims to the future of international alliances. Each sentence was carefully crafted, each word weighed for its potential consequences. Every agreement, no matter how small, was met with suspicion, but each was necessary to move forward. As the evening grew late, the conversation shifted. The foreign leader, exhausted from the long negotiation, leaned forward. "You've made your point, Putin. I admit, I didn't expect you to offer so much, but will it be enough?" Putin's expression softened for just a moment. "It's not about giving up. It's about ensuring that both sides leave this table in a stronger position." Then when they came, the silence in the room deepened as the gravity of their conversation hung in the air. For a moment, the two men simply stared at each other, each wondering if they had just signed an agreement that would change the course of history, or if it would be the first step toward an even greater conflict. In the end, they stood up, shaking hands in the dim light of the room. The deal had been struck. Russia had made concessions, but so had the other side. For now, a fragile peace had been established. There would be no immediate confrontation, no escalation, at least not yet.
Putin walked out of the room as quietly as he had entered. The cold air hit him as he stepped back into his car, his thoughts already turning to the next challenge. This victory, like so many before, was not one to celebrate publicly. In the world of geopolitics, the game was never over. One battle won was merely a momentary lull before the next storm. As his motorcade drove back to Moscow, the snow continued to fall, thickening over the Russian landscape. Putin knew that the world was changing, but for now, he had weathered the storm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, and new negotiations. And as always, he would be ready.